All right, so back to this visual again, very quickly. I want to um, uh, just reiterate the second question that we pursue in this pilot study, which is we went with the assumption that it is not just simply the attributes of the tool that will drive the success of diffusion and adoption, but there is something about the organizations as well. The virtual organizations developing the tool behind the tool drives also the success of the tool. So that's what we explore. We wanted to know what attributes of the organization drive success. So let's go to the next slide. So here is a list of 12 attributes that were generated out of the US data set of 100 plus interviews that were conducted. The results of this particular list also um, the results were actually published in a journal, and many of you may be familiar with Future Generation Computer Systems journal. It came out article came out in 2018, and I will share this paper and also the previous paper that I mentioned with Ian, so that if any of you are interested in reading the paper, you can reach out to Ian for a copy of the PDF. So here's a list of 12, and we again we what we did was we adapted to the EU context. We asked the European participants to actually rate and rank the importance of these different attributes in influencing adoption. So here is the result, and we can go to the next slide to see the underline of the top five. So here are the top five, and we will delve into a little bit more details with these top five attributes. So let's go to the next slide. So the first one is actually having bridging liaisons in the project. Initially, in the US case, people talked about having bridging liaisons to bridge between users and developers to create a robust tool. But in discussion with Ian and Sergio back in June 2018, we understand that in the EU context, something that's more interesting here is also bridging between the EU level and the individual country level type activities. So this particular attribute surfaced to the top as a number one attribute. So let's go to the next slide, 21. So the second one is the idea of growing organizational capacity. And in the conceptualization of organizational capacity, we refer to human resources, technical resources, as well as financial resources. And what this number two factor is telling us is that many of the projects struggle with growing organizational capacity in order to keep up with developing a tool and promoting the tool to a larger community of users. And the successful one are able to actually grow the capacity to promote the tool and the develop a tool to cater to the needs of the users. And let's go to the next slide. The third factor is actually engaging user feedback. And this is important because, as we know, if the tool and the technologies are not meeting the needs of the users, as we learned from the first section, the first list that we discussed earlier, the tool, if it is not meeting the needs, it will not be adopted and used by the users. So coming up with strategies as suggested in the questions here to engage with internal and external users. Internal users will refer to the original users in perhaps a co-collaboration and co-producing team. And external user will be new users coming to the tool. So finding ways to engaging users for feedback and also thinking about how to do it more frequently and more strategically become another important factor that the team can take on to promote the adoption of the tool. All right, next slide. The next one is raising sustainable funding. As we know that many of these projects actually cost a lot of money in order to operate, and funding is critical. And funding is usually short term. It's hard to garner long term funding for some tools, especially in the initial phase. So the tools that sometimes become widely adopted are the tools that are able to raise sustainable funding in order to continue to sustain its diffusion. So some of the questions that the virtual organization or the team behind the tool needs to ask themselves is, would it be possible to bring in continuing funding to sustain the work? If it is not, how can we create a bridge to our next funding so they strategically have to continue to think about funding? All right, next slide. And number five factor for this list, the organizational list, refers to maintaining personnel continuity. And this is important because, as we know, many of the projects are very academically based and academic driven, and a lot of participants on the projects are students, and sometimes they are postdocs or they're academic personnel who may have varying length of contracts. And so when the time that they participate in the projects can fluctuate, and that sometimes can impact the success, the ability of the team to maintain and promote the tool. So as we know that a lot of the expertise and knowledge actually reside with the personnel. So what turned out to be very important in the EU context is the ability to maintain personnel continuity. So let's go to the next slide. So again, here's a quick review of the top five, as well as a complete list of 12 attributes for virtual organizations. Before we transition to the next section, I want to pause for another opportunity for feedback, questions, comments, and suggestions. Any questions or suggestions?
So this is Bruce again. In the absence of any other comments, I just wanted to ask whether or not, I'm sure you have, but I'd like to know how you did. How did you compare the open source environments, in other words, open communities, with our research infrastructure communities? They are nominally open. In other words, anybody can kind of use our tools and so on, but they are de facto closed because of the funding models and the access models and so on. So they are quite different, and that means that the way in which the communities are set up tends to express themselves in slightly different ways. Has any thought been given to that, and how that would influence the ways in which people would go and do outreach and that kind of thing?
That's a very good question. I really appreciate that feedback. The next step that we would like to do is actually to conduct a follow-up interviews with the participants, because I think that question is very complex, and sometimes using a survey may not be able to get to it. So
Right.
in fact, this particular survey that we launched, towards the end of the survey, we actually asked participants if they are willing to be interviewed. If they were, they provided their contact information, and that is our next step, is to actually follow up with an interview so that we can ask them some of these detailed questions.
Right. So the things I would be interested in finding out there are, first of all, are there any invisible barriers? In other words, never mind what it says in the code of conduct, never mind what it says in the, the statement of use. When it comes down to actually using these things, when people try to contribute, are there any invisible barriers? In other words, does it take too long? Is it too difficult? Is the language barrier, that kind of thing? I myself have run up against these things many times, so I'm not saying that they're easy to solve, but knowing about them makes it easier to develop a winning strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that suggestion. And in our follow-up interviews, we'll make sure we ask those questions. And as soon as we have results, we'll be happy to actually share with the community. Thank you. Any other questions, feedback, suggestions?
Kirk, I have a question regarding the assumptions in the survey. So is the assumption that the tools that are in scope are developed by researchers, or
Within, yeah, sorry, finish your thought.
Or was it also open to popular tools which support the science, which are produced by industry, for example?
For this particular project, we are going with currently the assumption that the tools are produced and developed mainly by academic researchers. And as we continue to explore this study in the EU context, we are actually open to getting input on commercial tool as well, so we can do some comparisons. Are you noticing any particular difference between these two categories that you think that we should keep in mind?
Well, for sure, in the best practices of many communities of practice, some of the tools which are the reference are not developed by researchers specifically. Perhaps they are open source projects in some cases, but not necessarily. I'm thinking of large platforms like GitHub or Jupyter Notebooks, etc., where typically some of the concerns mentioned here would not be relevant. For example, I don't think anybody cares if GitHub is sustainable or not in using it.
Got it. Got it.
Share, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good piece of feedback.
Researchers don't even think about their ownership of results when they publish on Figshare. So there are different types of concerns, and I think extending to very common platforms in use by researchers would be an interesting expansion of the study.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that suggestion. It is our goal to further expand our data collection effort, and we would definitely include this suggestion as well in the next phase of our study. Thank you.
Thank you.